Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening.
For housekeeping, we would like you to know that this program is being recorded. Please keep your microphone off, and there would be an opportunity for Q&A and to greet each other. You can also put your questions in the chat. Thank you. So again, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening.
And welcome to this event. My name is 𝒓𝒊𝒔𝒆 𝒂𝒂𝒂, and I am a sister of Our Lady of Apostles. The OLA sisters and SMA fathers are delighted to be hosting this event for Laudato Si Week. The international theme this year is Seeds of Hope. In the face of a climate emergency, awareness has never been higher, yet action remains elusive. As global challenges intensify, so does the sense of overwhelm and inertia. How do we break through this paralysis to inspire and mobilize effective action and sow seeds of hope? This is what our speakers will be exploring this evening. Nellie McLaughlin, RSM, sister works in the area of creation, spirituality, cosmology, ecology, and sustainable living. She is a founding member of the Green Salt Land Trust, Ireland, author of Out of Wonder and Life's Delicate Balance. We have John Barry, Professor of Green Political Economy and the Director of the Center for Sustainability and Just Transition, Queen's University, Belfast. We also have Jane Mallet, Troca's Church Outreach Manager, previously the Laudato Si officer. Jane has also worked with the Laudato Si movement. Her specific focus is on climate justice and ecological spirituality as it pertains to Catholic social teaching. Facilitating the evening is Brian O'Toole of the Presentation Sisters Justice Decks. Once again, voucher to everyone, and I hand you over to Brian. And please remember to keep your microphones off. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to this chat, this question and answer session really to explore the topic of climate fatigue. Exactly what is it and what can we do about it? We have three superb guests this evening and we're going to ask each of them the first question, the same first question. And we would also invite you listening in. There are many on the line tonight who have lots of experience, and I'm sure have lots of questions too. If you have a question, please put it into the chat, and given time, we'll do our very best to come to your question indeed. So, Sister Nellie, I'm going to come to you first, if I may. And I'm going to ask you, maybe you tell us what exactly is climate fatigue, and why is it such an issue today? You're on mute, Sister Nellie. You're on mute there. There you go. You're all set. Thank you.
Is that okay now?
That's perfect. Perfect. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone, and I'm delighted to be with you. Lovely to see you all. And in answer to the question, it's a very complex question, obviously. What exactly do I understand by climate fatigue? I suppose the word that I would use would be overload. There's a lot of talk about climate, and particularly since Paris Agreement in 2015, and that was also the introduction of Laudato Si as well, and the UN Development Goals. So there was great hope that a lot of action was going to take place around climate change. And we know that since that, there's been a lot of talk about climate change, but very, very little action, particularly from a political point of view. And that sort of that's really a big cause, I think, of the fatigue part. There are many, many people doing great things and working very hard, but it's so difficult when the governments aren't on the same level, and you always keep hoping that they're going to come to that level. And also to know that the climate denial is funded by millions, trillions actually, by the fossil fuel companies doesn't help the matter either. I think it confuses it. And why is it an issue really? Basically, I believe it's an issue because we see ourselves as separate from planet Earth. Somehow we see the Earth as out there, separate from us, a thing, an entity, rather than a living organism that we are part of. And I think that sort of militates against being able to work together on it in a very sustainable and a very strategic way. So I feel that the issue today really is for us to come home really to who we really are, because the help that we're going to get in terms of climate change, we're going to get that help from planet Earth itself if we work with the Earth, work in companionship with the Earth. Because as we know, planet Earth has endured very many storms and droughts and ice melts and all the rest over millennia, and somehow has been able to come up so far. But what we know now is since the Industrial Revolution, a lot of what's been thrown at the Earth is caused by us, and the Earth can't handle that. So I think it's important that we try to work together as the Earth and ourselves, because we're all one anyway. And I think that's what we need to do. So I say that for starters, and then we can take it on after that.
That's super. That's super, Nelly. You've certainly set the ball rolling. Just before we ask the same question now to our next speaker, I was just going to ask you one question. You mentioned climate denial. Do you really think at this stage that there is a large group of people still denying that climate change is a real issue?
Yes,
okay.
Very much so. Very much so. Yes.
Right, perfect. Okay, Nelly, thanks for that indeed. We're going to come back to you again later on, so don't go anywhere at all. And I'm sure that there are people too listening in this evening who will have questions for you as well. If I could invite Jane maybe into the conversation, and maybe Jane, if it's okay with you, I might ask you the same questions I asked Nelly to start everybody off easily, shall we say. Maybe you'd help us understand what you understand maybe by climate fatigue and why you think it's such an issue today.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, it's not an easy question at all, but
sorry about that, Jane.
So to start us off easy, but yeah, it's a very important question, and I'm glad it's in our discussion this evening. So I suppose I understand climate fatigue as something that's going on quite deep within us. And as Nelly mentioned, it's definitely connected to this feeling of being overwhelmed by our news feeds and the stories around us. This leads us to a sense of helplessness when it comes to the ecological crises in particular. And when you think about it, it's the realization that the very fabric of the planet on which we depend is unraveling due to our own activity. And that fact is affecting us on a level I'd say we're not fully aware of. And it's affecting all aspects of our being, mentally, physically, spiritually. And in Laudato Si', Pope Francis invites us to become painfully aware of what's happening to the world right now. And he says, the phrase he uses is that we need to make this our own personal suffering. And it is a personal suffering when the veil is lifted on the crisis for you at whatever point on your journey that happens for you. But it's a very difficult journey, because having that veil lifted means, I suppose, owning up to and realizing the situation we find ourselves in. So climate fatigue, I think it's a combination of being overwhelmed by what we're witnessing daily on our news feeds. And also the ecological crisis is quite complex and multi-layered. And we know that climate anxiety is becoming a really big issue, particularly for young people. There's another phrase in Laudato Si where Pope Francis says something like, God has joined us so closely to the world that we feel the desertification of the soil as our own physical ailment. And it's back to that idea that this is affecting us on all sorts of levels that we might not be fully aware of. So in order to address this very serious issue, we need a response which is multi-layered and interdisciplinary, and that includes our spirituality, our faith, our belief systems, our values, and creating spaces where people can be nourished and heard and supported in this. And we'll probably get into this later on in the discussion, but you know, it's not coincidental that Pope Francis's starting point and where we begin in all of this is in contemplation. He says that's the antidote, that's the starting point, because we're dealing with such a deeply spiritual crisis that the response needs to start and begin from there. And I'm sure we'll get into that as we move along this evening as well. So it's waking up to this cry of creation, but we also need to hear creation's song in the solution. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Great, thanks, Jane. Just before we invite John in, you mentioned climate anxiety, and you mentioned it straight after you mentioned kind of realization that it's our fault and that there is a kind of a mental and physical and psychological pain. Maybe for those who aren't aware of what climate anxiety is, maybe you might just explain what that is and why it might be even different from climate fatigue.
Yeah, they probably are different. I mean, the fatigue is probably this, you know, this ongoing tiredness that we all feel from time to time by the bad news and the feeling of helplessness maybe. But I think the anxiety is something much deeper, and we all know what anxiety is, and that uneasiness that it can be felt within us. And I think the phrase climate anxiety is now kind of a buzzword, but especially for younger generations, it's looking into the future and maybe not seeing any hope in that future because of the reality of the crises.
Okay, Jane, thanks a million. That's bringing the younger folk into the conversation as well, which is very important to do. I might invite Professor John Barry into the conversation now. John, how are you? Good evening. And if it's okay with you, I'm going to put the same question to you. You've heard the answers from Sister Nelly and from Jane. So maybe you might tell us what exactly you think climate fatigue means and why it's such an important issue today.
Thank you, 𝒓𝒄𝒗𝒆. Lovely to be here with you this evening. I think as both Nelly and Jane have pointed, I think fatigue is natural, anxiety is natural. I mean, in fact, they're a part of a good human life. You know, we have to recognize that difficulties, pain, death, and so on, anxiety, sometimes despair, all of these things are normal, particularly in something as existentially troubling as the planetary crisis. For me, I think the fatigue lies in the fact that, particularly for those who've been struggling for governments to do something about this. I mean, Nelly pointed out, you know, going back to the Paris Agreement in 2015, and the Pope very skillfully released Laudato Si about 6 months before that to influence that conversation. But I think the science is really clear. We have to change capitalism. So I think we need to be really clear here that it's not the poor that's causing the climate crisis. It's not every part of humanity that is to blame, but it's the rich. I mean, we have the evidence that 10% of the richest in the world cause up to 50% of the greenhouse gases that are causing the climate crisis. So what we need to do is change the structure of our society. I can tell you now, as an academic who's been researching this for 30 years, we have all the technologies we need. We don't need any new technology. What we do need is a change of our economic system, which I think could go along with a change of our culture of in some respects, arrogance towards the earth and treating it as a thing. But I think the fatigue comes when, you know, there was a report that came out last week done by the Guardian newspaper where they interviewed, you know, 500 of the top scientists that write the reports that governments read and so on this issue. And many of them were clinically depressed because they've been doing their work for years, for decades, giving the information to the government and saying, now go do something about it. So I think the fatigue is a natural response to a sense of frustration that the first job of government is to protect the people. And sadly, our governments are not protecting us. So I think the fatigue, in a way, is a kind of sublated sense of anger or hopefully temporary resignation. I'll just end on that note that while I think fatigue is normal and natural, it becomes problematic, much like anxiety is, if you stay there. The issue is that we all get down, we all feel tired, but then you need to find the energy and the hope. And I'm sure all of us here on this call, including the speakers, have something to say about where we can find those resources of hope.
Thanks, John. That is a question that's coming up, you can be sure. But just to say to you too, that even in listening to you speaking, when we think back to 2015, we had the Sustainable Development Goals, which were a plan for the world. And this sounded like a super plan. We had, COP15 was something else. That was another part of the plan. And then we had Laudato Si. It was just a huge year. It was hope followed by hope, followed by hope. But what we're seeing and hearing now is that there seems to be even a greater fatigue. And you're talking about government responsibility. One of the issues with all of those plans is that they don't run in government cycles. They run to a 15-year plan or a longer plan. So to put your finger on it from the government's point of view, how do you think we could get them on board?
I think we have to start thinking about constitutionalizing the rights of nature, as countries like Ecuador and so on have done. In other words, take it out of the government cycle in terms of, we all have rights that should be not at the whim of government. So I think a human rights approach as well, it can be quite powerful. But you're quite right, Brian. It's even worse. It's not that the decisions we have to make are in decades or generational, that kind of 7th generation thinking. We should be making decisions now about what's the impact in 7 generations. Governments don't do that. It's even worse when it comes to the capitalist economy, which often works on the timescales of nanoseconds in terms of particularly financial. So we have to find ways of disrupting those rhythms of politics and economics that are completely out of sync with the what's needed for the earth. And I think one way, as I say, is putting these into our constitutions. And there is a movement now, certainly in Ireland and elsewhere, about bringing in things like the rights of nature, which I think would do a lot of good in terms of addressing some of these issues that we're talking about.
Just on a point there, David Gunn, who was regarded as the father, I suppose, to some extent, of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Irish ambassador who brought them across the line, we asked him specifically about SDG 8, which is kind of decent work and economic growth. And we kind of said, how can you reconcile both of them? Decent work is fine. We can see that that's necessary, but this constant economic growth and the need to keep growing, that is actually contrary to any preservation of the earth and minding of the planet. And when we asked him about it, he said, well, if we decided to split them or leave one out, 40 people would have left the room, and we felt it was better to have them in the tent. So we kind of thought, okay, right, we can see your point. But he too would say he's a little bit disappointed in the way things have panned out, even in terms of countries. And one point that you made, John, which was quite strong, was those who are poorest are affected most and affected first, and they are least to blame and least to cause for this. And then you also mentioned about rights for the earth. So I'm going to come back to you, Jane, if that's okay. If I'm not mistaken, Pope Francis has given the earth certain rights, or has awarded the earth certain rights in Laudato Si and later on in Laudato Deum. And I'm just wondering whether or not this is something that could be useful in terms of trying to reignite the issue of, because the first Laudato Si was an explanation. Laudato Deum is a real kind of, get up now, I've told you the science, get up and do something.
Yeah, I mean, Laudato Deum was definitely, I suppose, a kick for the political leaders that were meeting at COP28 last year. And it's, it's kind of gold in that scenario. And he also calls out the climate deniers in particular parts of the world and so on. In Laudato Si, he certainly talks about the intrinsic value of all creatures and the sacredness of all creatures and of the earth, and invites us to look at indigenous communities and their approach and the lens at which they look out at the world. In valuing the rights of nature and the sacredness of the earth. And I think that was a huge step, because he speaks about, really coming to see each element, each created thing, as a locus of God's presence, is the phrase he uses. And that was huge, because there's always the danger of, oh, we're falling into paganism and tree worshipping, but it was more recognizing, you know, the panentheism, the God, the spark of the divine within each species and creature. And I think that was huge. And when we, you know, are out there delivering workshops, especially on the whole spiritual side of this, that's the piece that really moves people and moves you out of that despair and into this, you know, beautiful relationship with creation, where there's a message within it from the creator, that can urge us forward. And that whole piece around falling in love with the earth, and we get that right, the action will flow out of people, because they will want to protect and to do everything they can for creation. So it's hugely important, and I'm really excited about the potential referenda on the rights of nature as recommended by the Citizens Assembly, and that's where these two things meet, you know. So yeah, hugely important.
That's great. Thanks a million, Jane, for that. Actually, I'm going to come to you, Nelly, if that's okay, because you mentioned governments first earlier on, when you mentioned kind of their despondency maybe, or their lack of, you know, their lack of attention at the time. But we're also, and it was Jane who mentioned the COP. Like, if we look at the most recent COP, we're looking at where it was held and who held it, and we're looking at Mary Robinson, who very gently kind of said, sorry, that's wrong. And your man had to come back on afterwards. The sheikh had to come back on afterwards and kind of, you know, readdress issues that she had brought up. But you could see her frustration. And I'm just thinking too, even when Jane is talking about Laudato Si, I can almost feel the frustration of Pope Francis. And I often wonder, does he get a bit fatigued? Not climate fatigue now, but just a bit fatigued about what he's hearing and the lack of action. And maybe that's where Laudato Deum came from. Nelly, I'm wondering, you brought up the governments first. What do you think they can do, or with NGOs or with others, or how can we kind of reignite this issue where there are some say they're suffering from a climate fatigue?
Yeah, well, I think I would approach that actually in terms of all of us, and then the government within that. It's just listening to the conversation and thinking about the topic for today. The sort of the image that comes to mind for me is, it's like we're at a Titanic moment, you know. The Titanic was the greatest ship ever built in Harland and Wolff, and when it was on its maiden voyage then from the south of England to North America, it was interesting. Somebody was saying, well, this, you know, even God couldn't sink this ship. It was so well made and that kind of thing. But anyway, just to draw the connection, I always think that the crew in that ship and the people who oversaw it, they were very aware of the icebergs in the North Atlantic. But they actually turned their attention more to the ultra-rich people who were on that ship, and spent their time looking after them and all of that. And then what happened was the disaster where the ship sank. And it's really similar today, you know, for us. I think the ultra rich, you know, the billionaires, all the rest, like, they're well looked after. And you know, as we know, even sort of. It's hard to say it, but even the big banks are supporting the fossil fuels and supporting all these rich people, ultra rich people, and they did it during COVID as well. You know, so there's something about that we have this sense that it doesn't matter what we throw at planet Earth, it's going to survive, and that's so childish, really. And we need to get out of that mentality and understand that planet Earth, you know, is a living organism, and the living systems, the fresh air, the clean water, the soil, the healthy soil, and the sun. These are the living systems that all of us need. The planet needs it, we need it, and we're all one in terms of that. But we have separated ourselves, just as they did in the Titanic, and you know, we saw what happened. So that's where I would kind of try to look at the actions then of the ultra rich in our society. You know, it's that neglect of our common home, And I think it was Marshall McLuhan said, you know, when thinking about the Titanic, he said, you know, there are no passengers on planet Earth. We're all crew. Every one of us has that obligation, you know, to keep it healthy, keep it vibrant, to use the resources well, and to call out the injustices, you know, as we find them, and all of that. So that's, I think we need to sort of work around that and try and see what we can do. It's an uphill task, you know, because when you think of, I just find this so crazy, but it's true. The big fossil fuel companies very cleverly decided to do away with the term global warming, and they put in climate change instead, because global warming is much more emotive, and they just knew that they couldn't keep using that term because, you know, people would know what's happening and would probably challenge them more. So they talk about climate change, and most of us don't understand all the technicalities of climate change, but we do understand global warming. So there's so much that we have to be aware of in terms of the big, you know, companies and what they're doing and how they're being supported by the government as well in doing that, you know.
That's perfect, Nelly. And actually, that example that you've given us, that analogy, is a super analogy. And as you kind of went on, then it became how we are not passengers, we are crew, which is really important. But
Yeah.
you've made a very strong argument for tackling the government on it. But I'm just conscious now, we have local elections coming up and we have European elections coming up, and probably early next year there may well be general election coming up. So I'm wondering, there are people on the call here. Let's say somebody knocks on your door. What is it that you might say? I might ask John, maybe, because John mentioned the government earlier, and he mentioned maybe some things that weren't quite right. So if somebody was to have a message for a caller to the door, what would your message, or how would you frame your message, John?
Really simply, you know, during the pandemic, and of course we're still not out of it. You were telling us, Brian, that
No, we're not.
COVID going on there in Rome. But during the pandemic, we declared a public health emergency, and our lives radically changed. You know, working from home, washing our hands, social distancing. You know, the government did act now unevenly, and there's lots of, you know, inquiries going on about how the government's reacted. But the Irish Dáil, in case people don't know, in May 2019, it declared a climate and biological diversity crisis. A week before that, the UK Parliament had declared one. And at this stage, I think almost every government in Europe and at local council level, they've all declared these emergencies. But what we've got to ask the prospective politician coming to your door is, okay, why aren't you acting like it is an emergency? Why aren't you acting like we did during the pandemic? Why aren't you mobilizing all the resources of the state to try and deal with this issue, to empower local communities to adapt their areas to flooding? You know, even if you don't understand the concept of global heating, warming, or climate change, a price of a bag of chips this year will probably be more expensive. And the reason is that we've lost about a third of the Irish potato crop through flooding. Flooding, which is now, you know, don't get me wrong, we get rain all the time in Ireland, but it is in keeping with the climate models that on the island of Ireland, we will experience the climate calamity in terms of these monsoon type rains that we just simply, our urban areas can't deal with them, storm surges, floods, and so on. So there's a food security aspect to this as well. So I would just simply ask this person looking for your vote, are you going to act like it's an emergency? Are you going to listen to the science? Because the scientists have been saying this very, very clearly for many, many years. And that's why a lot of them are getting frustrated, even up to the point of some of them being depressed because the governments aren't acting on the science. And then you link it back into the pandemic. Well, we acted on the epidemiological and medical science to inform policy. Why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we gracefully and justly moving away from fossil fuels as quickly as we can? Why aren't we, you know, changing the structure of our societies that's not based on endless economic growth? And that issue, Brian, just to finish in terms of the question you asked about why does that SDG have decent work and economic growth? A better way of phrasing that would have been, we need to go on a degrowth in the global north. We are growed up enough. We have more than enough wealth and resources in our societies. Where we need growth is in Africa and Asia and South America. So it's not against growth. It's to say that growth, to use another analogy, growth for its own sake is the ideology of the cancer cell. That's what cancer is. It's growth that's transgressed the limit where it's no longer healthy for the economy or the body indeed. I'll just leave you at one kind of other, just because of what Nelly was saying in terms of we're all stewards and so, or we're all, you know, crews.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of Alice Walker, the great African-American writer, who said, activism is the rent we should all pay for living on the planet.
Okay.
However you conceptualize activism, that's the rent we all owe to live in this beautiful planet.
Okay, well, I have a feeling everybody's head is down writing that now, so that they'll use it next time they get it. But if they remember nothing else from this tonight, but they remember that and they remember Nelly's analogy, that would be good too. And Jane, I want to approach you.
Sorry
Mentioned...
to interrupt, Brian. Your mic keeps fading out.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
It's a little bit muted. If you maybe if you.
If I move a bit better, is that? Can you hear me now? Is that okay? No,
it seems to be maybe a connection thing, because every now and then you're fine, and then it kind of
disappears
a little.
Okay. I'll keep going. I don't know what the story is. I'll keep going and see how we go.
All right.
If I do less talking then and just allow
no.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks very much indeed. Jane, I was just going to come to you, and we don't have a huge amount of time left, but you did mention the Citizens' Assembly. And John has mentioned biodiversity in a climate emergency, and Nelly has mentioned the Titanic. So I'm just wondering, is it a case that with all of this, like there seems to be, the words are said, like, you know, the talk sounds good. It sounds like we're doing great stuff, you know, and it sounds like Ireland is stepping up and doing their thing, and, you know, Citizens' Assembly, biodiversity emergency, climate action plan, SDGs, you know, we're doing something. Is that not enough? Is that a way?
It's great. We have a very good climate bill signed into legislation. Yes, the governments have declared climate and biodiversity emergency, but as John rightly pointed out, we need to act like we're in an emergency. So an emergency is the equivalent of what happened during COVID. And no one I can see in government or around us is behaving as we did in that particular situation. Greta Thunberg said this years ago, pull the emergency brake now, very clearly, because she says things so clearly and to the point. So all of us here, I mean, there's what, 130 people on this call, you know, we are activists, and we needn't be afraid of the word activists. It's, you know, we're not scary people. I'm an activist, lots of activists on this call. I read a book recently called The Hope by a guy called Andrew Harvey, and he says we need sacred activists, people who are filled with the joy of the creator, and have this inner sense of that's driving them, that they're deeply rooted in their spirituality and values, and they become these centers of hope and ripples of hope across their communities. And that can be in the smallest of actions. You know, Fridays for Future, every Friday, 1 o'clock at the Dáil, there's a group there. I'm sometimes with them. They're into their 285th week of sustained climate protest. And we need to join them. We need to be there every Friday if we can. John mentioned we've this amazing opportunity where we have local and European elections happening on June 7th. Each of us here need to know what we are demanding from those candidates. And if we all wrote to them, that would be a huge ripple sent out across the community. Friends of the Earth have an election toolkit on their website, a nice handy little brochure to keep by your door for when they call, and a list of things you can say to them, demanding that they deliver local climate action plans, provide clean energy. Actually on it is deliver a climate emergency package, get us off fossil fuels, which are killing us and killing millions of people around the world annually, ensuring warm homes for all, prioritizing a just transition, especially for those experiencing energy poverty in this country right now. We're subsidizing these fossil fuel companies to the tune of billions when that money could be moved into renewable energy sources. So we have the solutions. What's lacking is political will. There's no political will because we're not demanding it. So we have this amazing opportunity coming up on June 7th to really tell all of these candidates what we want and be that sacred activist to, quite frankly, do everything that we can at this moment in time to ensure a safe, livable future for everybody.
Thanks, Jane. You've certainly nailed it. Go ahead, Nelly. Did you want to come in there?
Just to add to what Jane is saying there, I think too that you know, we can also step up our response, you know, through social media and support different international events, like for example, 𝒉𝒂𝒂𝒕 is a very powerful one and worth supporting, and it certainly has done an awful lot since it started a few years ago. And like Greenpeace and all these ones, 𝒂𝒂𝒊𝒔, there's so many different ones that, and they're really involved, you know, both at ground level and also at political level, which is great, that both aspects are there. And then also another thing is we have, I keep thinking, another image which I have in terms of action, and which I find very hopeful, is it's like we're on one side of us as the community of people active, we have the young people for climate, and on the other hand we have the likes of Mary Robinson and the elders, that group really trying very hard at government level as well, and we're part of all of that as well, you know. And then there's so many among us now, because the age profile, particularly in Ireland and other countries too, it's much higher now than it was, and a lot of people who are not able to be out on the picket line anymore or supporting these things as they did, they're able to do it from where they are, you know, through what we call subtle activism or that kind of thing, sending their energy or their blessing or whatever it is to the people who are out in the front line doing this. And a lot of people like that want to be involved. They're still very alert and maybe not so mobile, but they want to be involved in our communities. And I think if we could maybe assist them a little bit and get them involved as well. We need everybody on board, really. So I would just support that as well, you know.
Thanks, Nelly. You actually, you actually referenced their young people, and Jane did too. She mentioned Greta Thunberg, who she said was very straight in her talking. And I'm just wondering, in particularly when it comes to young people, there seems to be, to some extent, there is some description of an anxiety that seems to be there, and an anxiety that's kind of fearful of the future, you know. And also, this climate fatigue, it might produce a kind of an apathy. I'm wondering, is there, and any of you can come in on this, is there an intergenerational response that might be of use when dealing with climate change or climate fatigue or any of these issues that are kind of concerning people? John, go ahead.
No, absolutely. I mean, I have the privilege of being an educator, and to my sad awareness, a few years ago, I realized I was leaving students more anxious at the end of their courses with me than when they came in. And so for me, I now have to put trigger warnings on the courses I teach, and I've had to bring in more emotional learning into my classes, which is something we're kind of talking in and around perhaps in this conversation, but I think it's good to get it out. There's a deep mental health strain of this. There's an emotional dimension which I think can express itself in anxiety and fatigue. And that's where, for those young people, or whoever it is that you see struggling to try and bring some sanity to what's happening, to give them whatever support that you can. You know, I've, like Jane, I've gone to be an ally of the young people in Belfast when they're doing the Fridays for the Future. More just to show that, you know, it's their show, as it were. We shouldn't be trying to, you know, muscle in and speak on their behalf, but to give them that support, particularly because they're the generation that didn't really cause this crisis, much like the poor hasn't caused it. So there is an obligation, particularly for those of us. I think of myself, I'm a privileged white male professor, and I think people like me with that privilege should be using that in terms of these events. That's why I spend an awful lot of my time now doing public speaking or in the media or anything else, just because I think there's a responsibility on those of us who have the knowledge to actually try and bring that to our communities, to co-create the solutions. Because the most important thing we need, I'll just finish on this, is hope. And I think what part of the problem we have now is there's too much happy clappy optimism. I mean, if you ask most people, even government, you know, politicians, business people, and so on, maybe even ordinary citizens, there's a sense in which they think a technology is going to be invented. You know, things like carbon capture and sequestration, or we're going to geoengineer the planet or something. And we have absolutely no empirical evidence that this is going to work. But there's a sense in which people want to, believe that there's going to be a solution that doesn't involve a lot of change. To me, it's the equivalent of what we say here in Ireland, it'll be grand. There's that sense that it's all going to work out fine. And I think that's a dangerous form of emotional response to this. We don't need optimism, which in the sense of you think things are going to work out fine. We need hope. Now, hope is very different because hope requires activism, it requires agency, but also hope has a shadow side. To be truly hopeful, you have to fully countenance failure. Optimism doesn't countenance failure. It's all going to be fine. Hope, you have to really hold out the possibility that we are heading down the trajectory of an uninhabitable Earth. The reality is the Earth itself is not in jeopardy. The Earth is seeing, 6 great mass extinction events. What's at threat now is the abundance of life we have now and a habitable Earth for human beings and our children and grandchildren. So I think what we need is to find ways of activating hope, and that requires agency. But also I think when we collectively come, even as we're doing here tonight, to share perhaps a sense of anxiety and grief and frustration, out of that then can come something positive, that we can actually do things together. So I do think, actually talking about the emotional impact of this is as important at this stage as talking about the science, because unfortunately for a lot of people, a lot of our citizens, the way climate is talked about, it's too technocratic, it's too scientific, it's tons of carbon, greenhouse gases. There's no story to it, where really from an ethical point of view, which I'm sure will resonate with many people here on the call, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor are the same. Climate injustice is the same as global and social injustice. They are absolutely inextricably connected. And I think talking about the emotional, the injustices, never mind the colonization, which is behind a lot of this, because, our countries often developed in the global north on the back of colonization and fossil fuels. So I think connecting it with that ethical dimension and emotional dimension, I think, is another way I think would bring more people into the conversation.
Thanks indeed, and thanks indeed for a very frank answer, very honest answer. I'd happily be a student in your class and listen to the energy that you come across with there. The time is coming against it, but I did have a question that I'd ask maybe all three of you just before we finish. Clearly, anything to do with the climate is very important to you, whether it's climate change, climate action, climate fatigue, climate anxiety, that you have an issue, you have something to say on all of this, and it's really important. But I'm just wondering, what can we do now about talking about our, bringing the issues of climate change to the fore in such a way that we mitigate, if that's not such a pun on a word, the climate fatigue, shall we say, or that we offset it. Jane,
I'll come in there. Yeah. I suppose the longer I'm in this work, the more I realize we've had enough of the heady stuff, and what people really need now, I feel, in this are spaces where they can talk about it, spaces where they can be supported and nourished, where they can experience this sense of ecological conversion. But that's a massive journey. It's a phrase, you just throw out there, but it's a huge learning curve. It's one that involves this painful awareness we've spoken about. And then where do you go with that? So if you take our faith communities around the country, these should be spaces where we are engaging in a deep, nourishing spirituality to address this issue. Like, this is Laudato Si week. We've lunchtime meditations going on all week for our Laudato Si network on various practices to help people cope with this issue, to keep them nourished, to give a sense of community, a space where they can talk, discern, and reflect on where they're being called to act. So it's hearing creation's cry, but it's also hearing the song that's there. And to come back to that phrase from Pope Francis, the antidote to this crisis is contemplation. That's the starting point. Reconnecting with the earth, reconnecting with that sense of awe and wonder that we've lost. And if we can provide those spaces for people, you'll hit loads of nails on the head. You'll be helping to deal with this fatigue, this anxiety. You'll be nourishing people spiritually, nourishing their faith, and also giving them a space to discern, well, with my gifts and talents, where am I being called to act in this? I'm alive at this moment in history for a particular reason. This is the crisis of our time. So where am I in this? If I'm in the church choir, I'll sing about it. If I'm somewhere else, I'll stand outside the door on a Friday, whatever it might be. So like this is urgent work that's needed. And just one last thing on this, we have a politically engaged generation of young people on this issue. And then we have, maybe a crowd of youth ministers over here wondering, I wonder how we could engage youth. And then we have 𝒓𝒂𝒗𝒆, and it's like these spaces aren't meeting right now. So maybe it's something to reflect on, how we can reach out particularly to young people, but also across the generations in addressing all of that. And I really do believe that's the role of the faith communities in this movement right now.
Thanks, Jane. What you're saying sounds like some of the dots aren't joining up the way we would like, but thank you very much indeed. Nelly, would you like to answer?
Yeah. One of the gems I think that Pope Francis has in it's actually an introduction to Laudato Si very early on, and he comes back to it at the end again, and he said what we really need is a sort of a, I'm trying to think of the right word. The way he puts it, it's like a universal solidarity. And there's something about that I think is so necessary, that we need this solidarity, and we need it with the earth itself. We need it with each other, with youth, with older people, with all of us. And there's something about that that's great. And he puts as an addendum to that core to that solidarity, that universal solidarity, is an interior journey in faith, for us. And taking those two together, I think that there's a great sort of framework there for this growth and togetherness, both as people, of all people, like the rich, poor, whatever, and all nationalities. And I think that touches also into, and I'm very aware of it as we're talking here, it touches into the whole refugee climate crisis that we're going through here in Ireland, as well as other places, and how we actually work together to create that universal solidarity that will see us through, with the underlying interior journey and faith, and then knowing that our common home is the home for everyone and for all life, and how we build that up with all generations, and particularly, to help young people to see that this is what we're trying to do, and this is really going to be, I think, what will bring us through this crisis that we're in at the moment, how we can work at that. Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Nelly, indeed. And John, I want to give you the last word. Maybe you might have a couple of things to say about what Jane said or Nelly said, or
yeah, though, I mean, the reality is we need a justice-based approach to all of this, and by justice I mean that's what love looks like in the public sphere, and that goes directly to what Jane and Nelly been saying about we need to reconnect with each other as a way of reconnecting back with the earth. But the reality is we're not outnumbered, folks. We're out-organized. The people wrecking the planet are very well organized. They meet in Davos and places like this in Switzerland every year, the rich and the famous and so on. And that's a quote from Malcolm X, actually. We're not outnumbered, we're out-organized. We need to get ourselves organized. There's lots of great things going on in local communities, but it is about trying to connect those dots together. And also to begin to ask ourselves, and particularly for young people, again, because I deal with them so much, but for all of us, it's easier to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism. I'll go back to the fact that it is the structure of our economy that's the root cause of these prices. Yes, there's a deep spiritual, ethical element that is also important to understand and so on. But we have to recognize that this system of endless growth, of the obscene inequalities in our societies, of private jets at a time of an ecological crisis, that simply has to end. That simply cannot continue. So we have to challenge capitalism, and I think Laudato Si is very eloquent in doing that. And the reality is that we have to also see this as a form of bearing witness. we should be aware that we on this call tonight may not be around to see, hopefully, the breakthrough in terms of a resolution in whatever way that comes about in different places around the world. And I think we have to let go of that kind of comforting idea. It's often the impatience of the radical activist, and I speak as one, where you want to see the results very quickly. This, in a way, even though there's an urgency to the crisis, it takes so long in the climate system for things to work itself out that even if Jane, Nellie, Brian, and myself were elected to run the world from tomorrow, and we're banning fossil fuels and we're reducing red meat consumption and so on, the system itself, the climate and the ecological system, will still be suffering for decades to come. So we have to see what we're doing here is that the struggle itself is the good. Yes, a good outcome is obviously a Brucey bonus. It's even, that's what we're working towards. But to see that the struggle may not be one that you see the fruits of, and that's why I think we need to see ourselves more as John the Baptist than Jesus in this, actually.
It's a good place to finish. I have to say, I was told, don't keep them too long, just keep them half an hour. I've kept you now 40 minutes, 45 minutes. And one of the reasons I did that was not only was the conversation so interesting and the inputs so electrifying, really, but we don't get this sort of expertise and this interest so often. So I thought I'm going to keep going with this. And I know for a fact everybody's interested because I've watched them. There hasn't been a person dropped off the call pretty much since we started. So we know we must have been getting it right. So Sister Nellie, I can't thank you enough. And Jane, I can't thank you enough. And John, all three of you for giving your time this evening, and more than I think you thought you might be giving. So thanks again for everything, for your preparation, for your answers, for the hard questions, the easy questions, and for the hope that you gave us at the end. So if you just hang on, because I think I'm not the only one with questions. There might be one or two others who have a question, and I noticed them coming in. I saw John McGeady from Social Justice Ireland, and I saw 𝒓𝒂𝒗𝒆 from the Dominicans put a comment in, and others too may well do. So I'm going to hand back over now to our compere this evening.
Do we have time for a few questions?
Oh, we can do, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, are we just, do we have enough time? Well, maybe I just have one question. Would each of you sort of say, you've come from different perspectives, is there any one action that each one of you would like to see people do in order to motivate themselves and motivate others? Maybe just a quick one-sentence answer. Maybe we begin with Nellie.
I would like to see us, I'd like, like myself as well, I'd like to see us, work more with the earth, it could be in terms of biodiversity, planting trees, whatever it is, because I'm very aware of the living systems and how much at risk they are and how vital they are into the future. And I think it would be great if we could, all of us, even some small act in terms of any of those living systems that would improve it would be great. And all the better if we can tune in with the wisdom of the earth, who's been around long enough, much longer than us, and probably has a lot to teach us as well in the act.
Thank you very much. Jane.
Okay.
I was struck by John's phrase about we're not outnumbered, we're just unorganized. I'd like us to get organized, to be honest. As faith communities, we have huge power, and I mean power in the good sense, and we need to get organized for these June 7th elections. And one thing everyone here can do in this call today is write a message to your local candidates using that handy toolkit from Friends of the Earth. So start there, get organized, see what happens, because the thing about active hope, emphasis on the active, is that once you start, it like the network extends. So you start meeting other people who are like-minded, and you soon get organized in a little group locally. So see how you can get organized.
Thanks very much, Jane. Thank you. John, last word.
What would Jesus eat? We should be using those questions to, many people here obviously in a faith organization, what's your church doing on this issue? I mean, the Pope's Laudato Si to me, I read as a beautiful love prose poem to the planet. But you'd say, okay, what's the church actually doing in terms of, you know, why isn't every Catholic church on the island of Ireland got solar panels on it and so on? But then there's also, as an individual, if you're a member of a trade union, what's your trade union doing? If you're a member of the local GAA club, what are they doing? The tidy towns. I mean, there are so many organizations that could actually act as a counterforce to what both Nelly and Jane and I was talking about, the power of fossil fuel companies and corporations and so on. We are not powerless, but it is that we need to connect those different ways of countervailing this power, which at this point is a death instinct. I can't overemphasize that enough. What we're dealing with here, in my view, comes close to evil, where the willful destruction of the living planet is seen as profitable. And whereas our discussion, what we're having tonight, perhaps of, you know, transcending capitalism or reconnecting with the earth and the rights of nature, that's seen as crazy. Whereas Elon Musk, you know, his desires to go off and colonize Mars, that's given serious attention. I mean, to me, that just shows you how out of whack our current times actually are. We are in very turbulent times. But I do think those organizations that many of us are connected with, certainly our own family, we need to talk about this an awful lot more in terms of educating ourselves and challenging ourselves and so on. So for me, that's what gives me hope. The hope lies in people. You know, we're an amazingly resilient species, and indeed, particularly the Irish people, given everything we've been through, we're still able to, you know, be here and be hopeful and be resilient. And we should, you know, take actual courage from our own historical experience as well. I mean, looking forward is also about, you know, honoring those who've gone and learning from those in the past. So, you know, in my view, you know, take Jesus, take Marx, you know, take hope.
Ryan, have you any other comment?
Well, you know, I might just take a sentence or two from what I've heard from each of the three tonight before we round it up. And when Sister Nelly came on first, she explained to us really just, she thought that there was a separation between ourselves and our planet Earth, and that we really needed to come home to who we are, and that we need to work in companionship with the Earth. She gave us the analogy of the Titanic and told us that we weren't passengers on the Titanic or passengers on this earth, that there are no passengers on this earth, that in actual fact, we're all crew. In other words, we all have a job to do. Jane, then when Jane spoke, Jane too admitted that the problem was extremely complex, but she also explained too that when there comes to a realization that there's a certain amount of this that is our own fault, that we have to wake up and think, well, what are we going to do next? And she explained Laudato Si very gently in terms of explaining how it is such an important document and such a seminal document in terms of how we can actually make the difference we're looking to be made. Jane referenced the Citizens' Assembly, and John referenced the biodiversity and the climate emergencies that are made. And all three gave some idea of what you could say when a TD or a councillor or a prospective MEP calls to your door. John kind of referenced to that there's a certain arrogance, that we are being kind of arrogant in terms of how we deal with the planet. And that we don't really care about those who are affected first and affected most. That loss and damage is not a thing for us at all. And that really the government is not acting in line with what is required, and that really what we need now is a degrowth. And he gave us that lovely phrase where he told us that, you know, activism is really the rent that we owe, or that we, is that right, John? Activism is the rent we need activism is the rent we pay. We pay. Look at this. It's not time. Activism is the rent we pay for being on this planet. And it's not the only, but Greta Thunberg was brought into the conversation. We were talking about sacred activism. We were talking about bringing the youth into the conversation. 285 Fridays for Future. So instead of, as well as just asking your TDs and your MEPs and your councillors to do this, why not turn up with there? Jane put into the chat there, she put in the Friends of the Earth election toolkit there. So if you wanted to have a question on the doorstep, then exactly that could be it. John spoke about teaching and the young people, and that they're very much involved, and said that, you know, it is a case that realistically justice is what love looks like for real. I thought that was great. And then both Jane and John, I think, and Nelly would agree that we're not outnumbered, but we're out organized. So in some senses, I have to thank all three, because John's last word then was that really Laudato Si is an eloquent love poem to the planet. And I think that's possibly the best way to leave this seminar tonight on Biodiversity Day, as Colette Kane pointed out to us earlier on. So to all three of you, I cannot thank you enough for all of your preparation, your input, your conversation, your intelligence, and your, you know, the inspiration that you have shown this evening. It's just been super. To say too that this webinar will be shared. And for anybody who's looking in on the call, not only would we ask you to take what Jane has put into the chat and not just read it, inhale it and send it back out the next time an MEP knocks on your door. They might think twice after that. But the other thing I would say is when you get the recording of this webinar, we would ask that you share it. There's 130 people. Even if you just took and said, I was at this webinar the other day and the conversation was super. It was very incisive and there was a lot said. And I really think you should hear it all. So even if you did that, that is activism in and of itself. So that is, as we say, the rent that you pay for being on this planet. So I got it right second time around, John. So listen, folks, Nelly, Jane, John, Jerry, Jeanette, and Michelle Robertson, who's there in the background as well. Thank you so much indeed.
Thanks a million. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
So once again, I add my voice to Brian's own to say a special thank you. Brian, thank you for facilitating. And to our speakers, Nelly, John, and Jane, thanks for the beautiful insights and for the information. Not forgetting all who have worked behind the scenes to make this evening happen. We are very grateful. Lastly, to all of you who have taken time out of your busy time to be part of this conversation, a million thank you and God bless you. Good night all.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, James.
Take care.